Imagine this. It's 722 AD. You're holding a report between your fingers and you laugh. Up there in the wet, cold north of Spain, a handful of rebels is hiding in a cave. Your scouts say they're starving, scraping honey off the rock to stay alive. You don't order a siege. You don't mobilize an army. You just scribble one contemptuous little line as casually as you'd crush an insect with the back of your quill. 30 wild donkeys. And you turn to your officers and say, "What harm can 30 wild donkeys do to us?" In that exact moment, without knowing it, you sign your own death warrant. Because those donkeys aren't a mob of lost peasants. They're survivors, men hardened by the collapse of their world, dug inside a landscape that has nothing in common with a normal battlefield. Up there, the Asturian mountains aren't something you cross, they're something you endure. Thick fog, freezing rain, cliffs that close the valley like a jaw. You think you're looking at a tiny, insignificant corner of the map, but it's actually a killing box. And in that cave, there's a name the Empire never took seriously: Pelagius. A man who doesn't just want to survive, he wants to hit back. He wants that contempt to turn into a mistake, then into panic, then into a grave. Umayyad pride has a blind spot. It counts men, but it forgets what terrain does to men. While the administrators in the south crunch tax numbers and daydream about their next conquests, up there the refugees are learning every stone, every pass, every narrow gorge where a huge army stops being a strength and becomes a traffic jam. They wait. They let the Empire believe that winter, hunger, and cold will do the killing for them. They win the one thing the weak must steal from the powerful: time. And when the order finally comes down, go finish off those rebels, it's already too late. What looked like a simple cleanup turns into a trap ready to snap shut. The 30 wild donkeys aren't running anymore. They've turned a valley into a slaughterhouse. The army climbing into the mountains has no idea it isn't marching toward a crackdown, but toward extinction. To understand why that insult was so fatal, you have to feel the speed of the Umayyad war machine. This wasn't a slow conquest. It was a rolling charge, a tide that grew with every victory. In 711, forces sailing from North Africa crossed Gibraltar, and almost immediately, resistance just evaporates. At Guadalete, the Visigothic nobility is shattered, the king disappears, and the command structure snaps. After that, everything falls in sequence. Toledo, Seville, Cordoba tumble like dominoes, sometimes without a serious fight, because locals open the gates before the first blow lands. For the conquerors, that ease becomes a drug. Each success convinces them they're untouchable, that God has signed off on every step they take. So when they look north at the rainy, fog-choked Asturian mountains, they decide it's just a rock at the edge of the map. From that scorn comes the wild donkeys line and the blindness that follows. They're looking for open plains where cavalry can charge. They don't find them, so they assume the story is over. The silence of the north isn't read as preparation, it's misread as surrender. Guadalete wasn't just a battle, it was a beheading. In a few hours, the Visigothic kingdom loses its head and then its breath. The flanks of the army, commanded by nobles who hate the usurper king, freeze at the worst moment. Some betray him, others just stand and watch. The monarch vanishes into the mud and chaos. No body, no tomb, just the idea of a crown swallowed by the riverbank. And when the king falls, the state falls with him. No more orders, no clear air, no plan B. So the cities hesitate, and then they open their gates. The invaders realize that the door of Europe is no longer guarded. They advance without stopping, like a fire that finds dry wood everywhere it goes. For their commanders, war stops feeling like a duel and turns into cleanup duty. In that high, heady mood, the north stops being a front and becomes a footnote. That's how a footnote ends up being labeled wild donkeys, and how a footnote becomes a blade. The fall of Hispania didn't begin with Arab sails on the horizon, but long before, in the narrow corridors of Visigothic palaces. This kingdom, which had ruled the peninsula for 3 centuries, wasn't murdered from outside, it rotted from within. Every time a king died, there was no clear heir, no accepted rule of succession, just a brawl of nobles ready to tear each other apart for the crown. The throne became a war prize, not an institution. In that climate, conspiracies, coups, and assassinations follow one another like seasons. Out of this chaos emerges Roderick, a warlord strong enough to seize power, brutal enough to blind his rivals and throw them into prison. King, yes, but a usurper king, surrounded by families who will never forgive him. Half the kingdom tolerates him, the other half dreams of cutting him down, even if it means cracking the foundations of the realm itself. So when the first Muslim ships appear in the south, the ground is already split under his feet. The kingdom doesn't fall from a single blow. It collapses because the supports inside were already gone. To the south, across the strait, lives a man who quite literally holds the key to Europe, Count Julian, governor of Ceuta. His fortress dominates the water. His mission is simple and absolute. Stop any army from Africa from setting foot on the continent. He is the gatekeeper, but one day, politics turns personal. Julian sends his daughter, a brilliant young noblewoman, to the royal court in Toledo to finish her education. There, according to the most persistent accounts, King Roderick sees her, desires her, and takes what he wants. When that news reaches Ceuta, something inside Julian cracks for good. He doesn't roar for justice. He doesn't raise an army. He does something worse. He goes quiet and starts calculating. In the cold silence of his resentment, he decides this kingdom is no longer worth defending. So he reaches out to the men waiting on the opposite shore, Musa ibn Nusayr and his general Tariq ibn Ziyad. The deal is simple and chilling in its clarity. I won't stop your passage. I'll give you the ships. In the spring of 711, merchant vessels leave the African coast loaded not with wool or grain, but with Berber warriors. Disguised as a trade convoy, this small fleet crosses a strait that Julian is no longer guarding. The man hired to lock the door doesn't just walk away, he puts the key directly into the enemy's hand. It's in this ruined landscape that our main figure steps into focus, Pelagius. He's not some random peasant rebel who appeared from nowhere. He's a man from the heart of the Visigothic order, a high-ranking noble, maybe related to Roderick, a member of the royal bodyguard. He sees the disaster at Guadalete with his own eyes. Standards collapsing, friends cut down, the king dissolving into the chaos. When the army breaks, he doesn't surrender. He falls back, step by step, toward the north, chased by the green and white tide of the caliphate, swallowing up cities and plains behind him. But for the new rulers, Pelagius is too dangerous to ignore. They don't kill him, they try to tame him. He's taken to Cordoba, not as a chained slave, but as a carefully watched hostage of value kept near the seat of power, surrounded by luxury, constantly under watch. A golden cage, the hope is to turn him into a compliant noble, a useful Visigothic face for the new order. But behind that mask of forced loyalty, something else is growing. Pelagius studies the palaces, the emirs, the administrators, and sees only a regime sitting on his world's corpse. Little by little, he stops thinking like a survivor and starts thinking like something else. Inside his mind, an idea takes root. He will not exit this story as a ghost. He will go back north, and in the rocks, he will turn himself into a symbol. While Pelagius plays the part of the tame noble in Cordoba, another project starts far to the north. The Muslim governor of Asturias, Munuza, isn't a dust-covered war hero. He's a politician. Instead of flashing steel, he prefers to weave alliances, and he fixes his eyes on one symbol, Pelagius' sister. Call her Adacinda, or by another name. What matters is her blood. The union he plans isn't really a marriage, it's genetic annexation. By marrying her, he wants to marry into the old royal line and bolt his rule onto the last surviving piece of Visigothic legitimacy. When rumors of this forced alliance reach Cordoba, something inside Pelagius snaps. They took his king, his kingdom, his future. Now they're reaching for his family, for the last trace of his line. The hostage accepts a simple truth. As long as he stays in this gilded cage, his story is over. So one day, he's just gone. Maybe he bribed guards, maybe Christian sympathizers helped, maybe he slipped out in a moment of confusion. What matters is that he vanishes from Cordoba and reappears as a ghost on the road. He crosses hundreds of miles of hostile territory, slipping past patrols and checkpoints. He doesn't run to France to hide. He runs back toward the mountains, toward that Asturias, where Munuza believes he already owns the stage. Pelagius isn't just coming back to rescue a sister or wash away an insult. He's coming back to smash the script the Empire wrote for him. The hostage has become a fugitive, and the fugitive has become the spark of a revolt. When Pelagius finally reaches the north, he doesn't find a safe haven. He finds a kingdom of stone and fog, The Picos de Europa rise in front of him like a wall thrown up against the world. Vertical cliffs, knife-edged gorges, paths where a horse can break a leg in a heartbeat. For a general raised on warm plains, this landscape is a logistical nightmare. For Pelayo, it's a fortress gifted by nature. As he moves through villages and valleys, he doesn't travel alone for long. At each stop, men join him. Dispossessed nobles, peasants crushed by taxes, young men who grew up under the shadow of defeat. Later, the enemy will mock them as wild donkeys. But in this moment, there's something else. People who literally have nothing left to lose. In a muddy clearing at the feet of the peaks, they gather. There is no crown, no throne, just a few rocks. There, these survivors raise Pelayo up as Prince of the Asturians. To Cordoba, it's a joke. To them, it's the birth of a home they'll defend to the last drop of blood. Pelayo knows he will never win on an open plain, so he chooses a choke point. Covadonga isn't just a valley, it's a bottleneck. A deep gorge where two rivers meet beneath sheer rock walls. The cave he occupies, carved into the cliffside, looks straight down over this narrow corridor like a stone balcony. To reach him, the enemy has to file in single, suffocating lines, trapped between cliff and river, unable to spread out their forces. Where an Umayyad commander sees a few cornered fugitives, Pelayo sees a simple equation. The larger the army, the more trapped it will be. It's a mountain Thermopylae, but without an escape route. No flanks to turn, no elegant maneuver possible. Just a corridor where the front gets crushed and the rear keeps pushing without understanding why. For 4 years, his men learn every ledge, every overhang where they can send boulders and tree trunks crashing down. They aren't hiding in the cave, they're setting a trap and inviting the Empire to walk into it. In 722, the order finally comes. The North must be taken care of. Nobody calls it a campaign, they call it a formality. The commander chosen is Al-Kama, a seasoned veteran, used to quick victories. When he looks at the map, all he sees is a tiny rebel pocket in the middle of some rocks. He's given a massive force. Christian chronicles claim tens of thousands of men, more than enough to crush an entire province. For him, it's a punitive march, nearly a tour of inspection. The army pushes into Asturias, banners snapping in the damp air, cavalry reluctantly inching along trails far too narrow, infantry packed tight in the gorges where the echoes make every sound heavier. Some soldiers, born on the hot plains of the south, feel in their gut that something is off. Here, the forest closes in, the fog eats the columns, the cliffs loom over everything. But Al-Kama doesn't doubt. He doesn't see a trap, just annoying terrain that will slow down his inevitable victory. When his scouts report that Pelayo is holed up in a cave above a gorge, he reads it as proof of weakness. The enemy is cornered, pinned, with nowhere to go. He believes he's marching toward a surrender, maybe a brief skirmish at worst. What he doesn't see is that with every step deeper into that valley, the mountains are tightening their grip. The path he's on isn't an access road, it's a one-way corridor into a tomb whose walls are made of rock, rain, and silence. Before he lets his soldiers loose, Al-Kama plays one last card: words. He doesn't send an officer, he sends a man of God. Riding a richly adorned mule, Bishop Opus moves alone into the gorge, a bright decorated figure among dark helmets and armor. To the army below, he's a valuable ally, royal blood, a high churchman who has chosen to live under the new regime. To the men packed into the cave above, he's something else entirely. A traitor, the voice of those who chose to bow rather than fall. Opus raises his head toward the cave mouth and calls Pelayo by name, almost like a brother. He doesn't threaten him, he reasons with him. The entire old kingdom has fallen, he reminds him. The great cities have submitted. The Goths couldn't withstand the Ishmaelite storm. How on this little mountain can you hope to succeed where an entire nation failed? Come down, accept reality. They'll let you rule here as a friend of Cordoba. For the men shivering behind Pelayo, those words must carry a cruel kind of temptation. Life, safety, an end to hunger. But the answer that echoes out of the cave isn't a calculation. It's a statement of faith. Pelayo speaks of the mustard seed in Scripture. The smallest of all seeds, despised, yet destined to become greater than all. From this little mountain, he declares, the salvation of Spain will arise. He rejects the gold, the title, the bought peace. In a single line, he turns their hideout into a sanctuary and that handful of fighters into the core of a future kingdom. Appas understands nothing will bend this rock. He turns his mule around, his gaze heavy, and murmurs to Al-Kama that they will have to fight and that only God knows how it will end. When Appas rides away, Al-Kama stops listening to speeches and goes back to what he trusts: brute force. He raises his hand and gives the crisp order his men have heard 100 times on 100 fields. Slings and archers, forward. The tip of the army moves deeper into the gorge, archers lifting their bows toward the cave carved high above. The plan is simple: saturate the entrance with missiles, smother the defenders under a rain of iron, then send in the infantry to finish the job. The first volley briefly darkens the gray sky. Dozens, then hundreds of arrows whistle upward toward Pelagius' lair, and that's when the mountain shows its secret. The cave isn't a deep, flat tunnel. It's a stone overhang. Shots that are even slightly off strike the limestone ceiling, ricochet at sharp angles, and crash back down into the tightly packed ranks below. Medieval chroniclers will call it a miracle, arrows turned by the hand of God. A modern physicist would talk about angles, velocity, and unforgiving geometry. For the men jammed in that gorge, there's no theology and no theory, only the shock of being hit by their own arrows, ranks buckling before they've even seen the enemy. And it's exactly in that blink, when the monster's eyes are stinging, that Pelagius chooses to move. In the split second of confusion caused by arrows raining back on their own lines, Pelagius gives a quick signal. The cave suddenly spews out his men. They surge down the slope like a human landslide. Faces smeared black, wild cries ripping through the gorge. They aren't a neat, drilled legion, but an avalanche of fury. Short swords, axes, broken spear shafts, simple stones clenched in fists. They crash into the Umayyad vanguard, which is still half shielding itself from a threat it thought was coming from above. But the real trap isn't there. Up on the fog-draped ridges, other shapes have been waiting. At the signal, they heave over the edge, the trunks and boulders they've spent days prying loose. The cliff explodes. Tons of rock and wood slam down onto the compressed column below. The gorge turns into a giant grinder. The front tries to fall back. The rear is still pushing forward, blind to what's happening. In the middle, Al-Kama tries to rally his men, to carve out enough space for a counterattack, and then he's simply gone, swallowed by the chaos. The general who mocked the wild donkeys dies like any other man in a jammed canyon, trampled, crushed, lost in the confusion he didn't see coming. What's left of the Umayyad army doesn't retreat, it runs. With no general, no standards, no structure, the survivors pour eastward, convinced they've at least escaped the hell of Covadonga. But the mountains aren't finished with them. To get out of this stone maze, the column follows the Diva River along a narrow path cut into an unstable slope called Koskaya. It's wet, muddy, and overloaded with thousands of terrified men and horses. The ground starts to groan. Then the hillside gives way. It's not a few rocks. It's an entire slice of mountain tearing free and crashing down onto the path. The roar drowns out everything: orders, prayers, screams. Soldiers who help conquer half the known world are crushed without ever seeing a single enemy. Chroniclers will talk about tens of thousands dead, a river dammed by bodies, an army buried so completely that the earth itself seems to have closed over it like a secret. Back in Cordoba, no messenger returns. Al-Kama's expedition has simply vanished. In the Umayyad imagination, Asturias stops being a minor problem spot and becomes a cursed graveyard. Raids will still be launched in the future, sure, but nobody will again seriously try to conquer those peaks for good. Without realizing it, the rock has just handed Pelagius the rarest gift: breathing room that the Empire no longer dares to interrupt. In the aftermath, Asturias is no longer a forgotten corner on the map. It's a blank space the Empire is afraid to touch. No Umayyad detachment camps up there. No governor issues orders from those valleys. Pelagius comes down from the mountains, no longer as a fugitive, but as a victor. Munuza tries to flee south, loaded with gold and second thoughts. He's intercepted and cut down on the road. With the politician dead and the general gone, the provincial leadership is decapitated in turn. So, in a valley near Cangas de Onis, the survivors gather once again. They have no crown, no cathedral, just dented shields and scarred armor. Following old Germanic custom, the warriors lift Pelagius up on a shield and proclaim him king. It's a tiny kingdom, wedged between sea and rock, but it's alive. From that seed will eventually grow Asturias, then Leon, then Castile, and the long grinding movement of the Reconquista. When Granada falls in 1492, the Christian monarchs will look symbolically back to that cave, to that day when, century after century, everything began with 300 men refusing to say yes.